The year could be 1348, or maybe 994. The exact date is less significant to you than the climate, which has been damp, frigid, and merciless for as long as you can recall. You stir on a bed of wet straw, the morning's chill gnawing at your bare skin, and your gut clenches with a familiar, aching void. In your world, hunger isn't a passing discomfort. It's the central force of your being, the timepiece that governs your every waking moment. There's no coffee to shock you into alertness, no eggs sizzling in fat, no well-stocked larder of choices. There is just the daily portion. You rise and grasp for the very core of your existence, a loaf of dark, heavy rye bread. It feels like a stone wrapped in coarse fabric, weighty in your palm. This object appears deceptively plain. It is merely flour, water, salt, and patience. Yet, within this particular loaf, concealed in the dark, flecked interior, lurks a botanical mischance with the power to unravel your sanity and corrupt your body from within. We are not gathered to discuss the opulent feasts of monarchs or the spiced vintages of the gentry. We are here to examine the stark logistics of existence and how a microscopic fungus transformed humanity's most fundamental staple into a tool of mass psychological devastation. To comprehend the toxin, we must first explore the laboratory where it was created. Let us move from the damp morning chill into the village bakery. Discard any quaint image of a modern pastry shop. This is a dim, industrial chamber, a calorie factory built to keep a populace from perishing for another day. As you force open the massive wooden door, you are met by a solid wall of heat, a jarring contrast to the cold outside. The atmosphere is saturated with a smell that is intricate, primordial, and overpowering. Beyond the fragrance of baking bread, you detect the sharp scent of combustion. Inside the enormous stone oven, oak smoulders slow and hot, its tannic vapor blending with the biting, sour funk of the sourdough culture. Your vision adapts to the gloom, illuminated solely by the flickering orange light from the oven's mouth. The very air seems to vibrate with millions of flour particles suspended in the drafty space, covering the soot-blackened walls with a ghostly white film. Pay attention to the room. It possesses a rhythmic stillness. You can hear the heavy, damp smack of dough against wood as the baker grapples with the trough. Unlike pliable wheat dough, rye is glutinous and leaden, demanding the baker's full upper body strength to work. Grunts of exertion mingle with the slap of the dough on oak and the rasp of iron tools. This is the sound of pure energy expenditure. Each calorie they use kneading this bread has to be replenished by consuming it. Approach the oven. Its floor is constructed of specialized bricks or flat stones, heated to a temperature that would instantly sear your flesh. The baker wields a peel, a long-handled wooden shovel, worn smooth by decades of use. You can hear the dry scrape of the wood as it slides across the stone, positioning loaves deep within the cavernous space. The heat radiating from the bricks is ferocious, parching your eyes and making your skin tingle. There is no gauge, no knob to adjust. The temperature is assessed by the glow of the bricks and the feeling of heat on the back of a hand. It is an inexact art, depending wholly on sensory judgment. In a corner, leaning against the wall, are the sacks of flour. They are coarse burlap, slumped heavily on the floor. To the casual observer, the flour appears grey, dotted with dark flecks. In the dim light of the bakery, these dark specks vanish into the shadows, resembling bran, pieces of husk, or maybe just grit from the millstone. But these specks are the only caution you will receive. They are the pulverized remains of the intruder, poised to be awakened by the warmth and moisture of the dough. To grasp why this particular poison found its way to your plate, we must look beyond the bakery and out to the field. We must examine the grain itself, Within the order of medieval agriculture, a rigid class system exists. At the pinnacle is wheat, Triticum aestivum. This is the gold standard, producing a white, light flour that rises effortlessly into airy loaves. The nobility, the clergy, and the affluent merchant class all prefer this grain. But wheat is a delicate, high-maintenance crop, demanding rich soil, temperate winters, and arid summers. This plant is suited for the Mediterranean, for gentle climes and easy cultivation. And then there is rye. Secale cereale is the grain of the survivor, the agricultural equivalent of a citadel erected on a marsh. In the damp, acidic, sandy soils of northern Europe, regions like Pomerania, the Alpine fringes, and the rain-drenched fields of England, wheat simply cannot grow, rotting in the earth or succumbing to frost. But rye flourishes. This scavenger crop evolved to wring life from land that has nothing left to offer. While wheat roots might explore a short distance into the topsoil, the root network of a single rye plant is a vast subterranean web. Its roots can drive 2 meters deep, pushing through hardpan and clay to find trace minerals and water inaccessible to other plants. Tenacious and efficient, it is biologically engineered for scarcity. Due to this resilience, rye served as the bridge across the hungry gap. This is the dreadful period in the medieval year, typically late spring and early summer, when reserves from the prior year's harvest are depleted, but new crops are not yet mature. You watch the green shoots in the field, aware they are weeks from being food, while your granary stands empty. Rye, especially winter rye sown in the fall, is frequently the first crop to be harvested. It is the lifeline. It is the sole barrier between the peasant and starvation. It is not selected for its taste, which is dark and acidic, nor for its baking properties, which are dense and sticky. It is selected because it endures. But to truly appreciate the trap, we must examine the plant's anatomy more closely. A brief glossary of the grass is necessary, because the devil, as they say, is in the particulars. First, there is the culm. This is the hollow, segmented stem of the grass. In rye, it is tall, significantly taller than modern wheat, sometimes growing to 6 feet. It sways dramatically in the wind, a sea of grey-green motion. At the apex of this stem rests the spike, the head of the grain where the seeds are formed. Within the spike, we discover the spikelet, the individual reproductive unit. This is shielded by the glooms, 2 small, scale-like leaves at its base. They are the initial line of defense, tough and papery. Above them are the lemma and the palea, the inner husks that encase the developing kernel. Protruding from the tip of the lemma is the awn. If you have ever traversed a field of rye, the awn is what you feel. It is a long, stiff, needle-like bristle, coarse to the touch, meant to discourage animals from feeding on the seed head. This structure seems impenetrable. It resembles a suit of armor, crafted to protect the valuable starch within. But rye possesses a critical vulnerability, a biological peculiarity that sets it apart from wheat and barley. Wheat is predominantly self-pollinating. It fertilizes itself while the flower remains tightly closed. Its reproduction is a private, internal matter. Rye, however, is allogamous. It needs cross-pollination. It depends on the wind to transport pollen from one plant to another. To accomplish this, the rye plant must do something risky. For a short period, usually on damp spring mornings, the protective glooms and lemmas must separate. The feathery stigma, the female part of the flower, has to emerge into the open air to capture the drifting pollen. The plant essentially opens its defenses. It exposes its most sensitive internal organ to the world, hoping to receive a grain of life. It is at this exact moment, when the glooms are spread apart and the feathery stigma waits in the humid air, that the crop is compromised. Because the wind carries more than just pollen. In a wet, cool spring, the wind also carries spores, and one particular spore, floating unseen on the breeze, is searching for precisely this kind of vulnerability. It lands on the stigma, imitates the chemical signature of pollen, and deceives the plant into accepting it. The rye believes it is being fertilized. In truth, it has just been infected. The grain you are anticipating, the one meant to save you from the hungry gap, is lost before it has even started to form. In its place, something else is about to grow, a dark, parasitic counterfeit that will develop comfortably inside the protective husk, concealed from sight, awaiting the harvest. The spore that has just settled on the feathery stigma of the rye flower is microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, and completely indifferent to the human misery it is about to unleash. Its name is Claviceps purpurea. For a botanist, it is a remarkable specimen from the Ascomycota division, a fungus that has developed a brilliant, if parasitic, method of survival. To the medieval peasant, it is a divine curse. To you, the witness of this slow-motion catastrophe, it is simply a biological mechanism performing its intended function. Once the spore lands on the moist, receptive surface of the flower, the countdown begins. It does not hesitate. Activated by the same chemical cues that signal the arrival of a pollen grain, the spore germinates, but instead of sending a fertilization tube downward to form a seed, it extends long, thread-like filaments called hyphae. These hyphae are the probing fingers of the fungus. They burrow down through the style, navigating the plant's internal structure with terrifying accuracy, heading directly for the ovary at the base of the floret. This is the invasion. It is silent, cellular, and absolute. Within a few days, the hyphae reach the ovary. This is where the rye plant planned to store its starch, the energy reserve meant to grow the next generation of grass. The fungus seizes this supply line. It starts to feed on the plant's sap, the sugars and nutrients being pumped up from those deep, scavenging roots we mentioned earlier. The ovary is effectively consumed and replaced by a soft, white, cottony mass of fungal tissue. The plant, oblivious that it is nurturing a parasite, continues to channel resources to the site. This results in the first visible stage of the infection, a phase known as the sphacelia, or more commonly, the honeydew stage. As the fungus rapidly metabolizes the plant's sugars, it excretes a byproduct, a thick, yellowish, sugary slime. If you were in the field during this period, usually in the damp warmth of late spring, you might notice the rye heads glistening. Droplets of this sticky fluid ooze from between the glooms, trickling down the stem and onto the leaves below. It resembles dew, but it is viscous and sweet. This sweetness is a trap. The honeydew is rich in sugars, which entices insects, flies, beetles, and moths. They land on the rye head to consume the sweet secretion. As they move through the sticky fluid, they collect millions of asexual spores, conidia, that are suspended in the ooze. When the insect travels to the next plant, it carries the infection with it. This is a secondary wave of biological warfare, using the local insect population as a delivery mechanism to spread the fungus throughout the entire field. The field is literally weeping with infection. As summer advances and the air becomes drier, the honeydew phase concludes. The fungus ceases to produce the sticky fluid and starts to solidify. It is preparing for survival. The soft, white mycelium that has replaced the rye kernel begins to compact. It absorbs moisture, concentrates its chemical compounds, and forms a hard, dense structure known as a sclerotium. This is the object that will find its way into the bread. The sclerotium grows larger than the original grain it has supplanted. It pushes out from the husks, extending beyond the glooms where a normal kernel would be concealed. It is a curved, horn-like projection, hard as stone and dark as night. While a healthy rye grain is a light greenish tan, the sclerotium is a deep purplish black on the outside and a dingy white or pinkish grey on the inside. It resembles a rooster's spur, which is why it was often called cockspur rye. To the untrained eye, or perhaps the weary eye of a harvester working in the fading light, it looks like a grain that has simply grown too large, or maybe been scorched by the sun. But inside this hard black spur, a complex chemical synthesis has taken place. The fungus has converted the simple sugars and nitrogen from the rye plant into a suite of powerful alkaloids. It has created ergotamine, ergocristine, and derivatives of lysergic acid. These are not nutrients. They are potent vasoconstrictors and neurotoxins. They are stable, resistant to heat, and patient. They are waiting for one of two outcomes: to drop to the ground and survive the winter, or to be harvested, threshed, and milled into flour. In its natural cycle, the sclerotium is designed to fall. As the rye stalks dry in the autumn wind, the heavy spurs are shaken free. They land on the soil, where they remain dormant through the freezing winter. They need a period of cold stratification to trigger the next phase of their life. They are essentially fungal seeds, waiting in the frozen earth for the next wet spring to release their spores once more. But in the medieval agricultural system, we do not allow the grain to fall. We harvest it, and in doing so, we break the cycle, gathering the poison into our arms and carrying it, unwittingly, directly into the heart of our food supply. The tragedy of the harvest is not one of evil intent, but of haste. To comprehend how a village poisons itself, you must first appreciate the sheer, desperate urgency of a medieval harvest. We often romanticize this time in history, the golden light of late summer, the community laboring together in the fields, the pastoral charm of the sheaves. But for the peasant farmer, the harvest is not a festival. It is a rescue operation. You are in a race against the elements. Every hour the grain remains in the field is an hour it is exposed to rain, mold, hail, or birds. When the word goes out that the rye is ripe, the entire village mobilizes in a state of controlled frenzy. The reapers advance in a staggered line, swinging their scythes in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. The action is repetitive and physically draining. Step, twist, swing, recover. Step, twist, swing, recover. An expert reaper is not examining individual stalks of grain. They are focused on the line of the cut, assessing the terrain, and keeping pace with the team. They are cutting thousands of stems per minute. In this blur of activity, the rye heads are just a wash of colour, a sea of pale gold and dusty brown. If a reaper were to halt, bend down, and inspect a single head of rye, they might notice the black, curved spur of the ergot fungus protruding from the husk. It stands out against the pale chaff, a dark, alien claw. But no one stops. To stop is to disrupt the rhythm, to slow the line, to endanger the crop. The rye is cut, it drops, and it is immediately collected by the binders following behind. The binders are working just as quickly, gathering armfuls of cut straw and twisting them into sheaves. They are grabbing the grain by the handful, their skin abraded by the rough awns, their eyes burning with dust. In a single sheaf, there might be 500 heads of rye. If 50 of them are infected with the black spur, they are simply folded into the center of the bundle, concealed by the mass of healthy straw around them. The ergot is camouflaged by its sheer volume. There is also a failure of identification. We have the advantage of hindsight and microscopy. We know the black spur is a toxic fungal sclerotium. The medieval farmer did not. They had names for it, certainly. They called it cockspur for its resemblance to the spur on a rooster's leg. In some areas, it was called wolf's tooth, but it was generally considered a weed, a natural contaminant, or perhaps just a sign of a poor year. It was not seen as a deadly poison. It was viewed in the same category as a thistle or a piece of gravel, something undesirable in your bread, but not something that would kill you. It was an annoyance, not a biological weapon. Once the sheaves are dried and brought to the threshing floor, the separation process starts. This is where the poison should be eliminated, but instead, it is where the contamination becomes irreversible. Threshing is a violent process. The dried sheaves are beaten with flails, heavy wooden sticks connected by a hinge. The objective is to shatter the seed heads and dislodge the grain from the stalk. The air in the barn becomes thick with golden dust, floating chaff, and pulverized straw. In this chaotic, dimly lit environment, the ergot spurs are knocked loose right alongside the rye kernels. They fall to the floor, mixing intimately with the food. Now comes the winnowing. This is the ancient technology of separation. The threshed mixture is tossed into the air with a winnowing basket or fan. The principle is simple physics. The wind carries away the lighter chaff, the husks, the straw, the dust, while the heavy, dense grain falls back to the floor. It is a beautiful, elegant system that has been effective for thousands of years, but it fails utterly with ergot. The fungal sclerotium is dense. It is solid, compacted matter, with roughly the same weight and aerodynamic properties as a large grain of rye. When the farmer tosses the mixture into the air, the wind blows away the chaff, cleaning the grain. But the ergot spurs fall straight down. They land with a satisfying, treacherous clatter alongside the good rye. The winnowing process, intended to purify the harvest, effectively concentrates the poison. It removes everything harmless and leaves behind only the grain and its toxic counterfeit, perfectly mixed and ready for the mill. The sack of grain, now a blend of life-giving rye and life-ending fungus, departs the farm and heads to the most crucial technological structure in the medieval world, the mill. Whether driven by the slow, churning power of a river or the creaking sails of a windmill catching the wind, the mill is the choke point of the food supply. It is a place of noise, vibration, and immense physical power. As you near the building, the very ground seems to vibrate. Inside, the air is thick with a different kind of dust than the bakery. This is raw, suspended starch, flammable and suffocating. At the core of the operation are the stones, enormous geological instruments weighing over a ton each. The bottom bedstone is stationary, while the runner stone spins above it, balanced with terrifying precision. For tough, fibrous rye, the stones must be set very close. Their facing surfaces are carved with a complex pattern of grooves, called furrows, which function like scissors. As the runner stone rotates, the edges of the furrows cross each other, shearing the grain open before crushing it into powder. The miller pours the sack into the hopper, a wooden funnel suspended above the stones. A device known as the damsel, a wooden shaft that rattles against the stones, vibrates the hopper, shaking the grain down in a steady, rhythmic flow. The rye kernels and the ergot sclerotia tumble down the chute together, indistinguishable in the stream, and drop into the eye of the runner stone. Here, in the dark, crushing space between the spinning rock and the fixed bed, the physical form of the poison is fundamentally changed. The ergot sclerotium is hard, but it is also brittle. Under the immense weight and friction of the millstones, it does not flatten like a piece of bran. It shatters. It is pulverized into a microscopic dust. The shearing action of the stones serves as a perfect homogenizer. If the ergot had remained whole, you might have been able to pick it out of your porridge, but the mill ensures the toxin is distributed evenly throughout the entire batch of flour. A single handful of infected spurs is now spread across 50 pounds of food. The poison has been diluted in volume, but its coverage has been maximized. The friction creates heat. If you were to touch the flour as it pours from the chute, it would feel warm, almost as if it were alive. This heat is crucial. While high temperatures can destroy some biological contaminants, the alkaloids in ergot are stubbornly heat-stable. The friction of the stones does not neutralize the toxin. If anything, the warmth helps to release the oils and volatile compounds within the fungus, binding them more intimately with the starch of the rye. The resulting product flows into the meal bin. It is not the snow-white powder you find in a modern grocery store. Medieval rye flour is a whole meal. It contains everything: the white starch, the brown bran, the germ, and, in this case, the pulverized purple fungus. The color is a telltale sign, if you know what to look for. Clean rye flour is a light greyish tan. Contaminated flour takes on a darker, dirtier appearance. It looks speckled, with tiny bluish-black dots scattered through the grey mass. But in a world without electric light, where flour is often mixed with bean or pea flour to extend the supply, a slightly darker shade is easily overlooked. It just looks like peasant flour, coarse, unrefined, and nourishing. There is another warning sign, one that appeals to the nose rather than the eye. As the flour warms, the pulverized ergot releases a specific chemical signature. It is a faint, earthy smell, different from the sweet, nutty aroma of crushed grain. In high concentrations, ergot smells chemically similar to trimethylamine. It is a scent that verges on fishy, or perhaps like decaying meat masked by damp soil. But in the dusty, overwhelming atmosphere of the mill, surrounded by the smell of grease, river water, and stone dust, this subtle marine odor is completely drowned out. The miller, even if he notices the dark color or the strange smell, is caught in an economic bind. He takes a toll, or multure, a percentage of the flour, as his payment. If he discards a batch of grain because it looks off, he is throwing away his own income. The peasant, watching their harvest being turned into flour, cannot afford to be choosy. To reject this flour is to choose immediate starvation over a potential abstract illness. And so, the decision is made by default. The dark, speckled flour is scooped into sacks, loaded onto a cart, and sent to the bakery, where the final stage of the disaster will be baked into a loaf. The sack of contaminated flour is now emptied into the mixing trough. This is where the dry, dormant catastrophe becomes active. Until this point, the ergotized flour was merely a powder, stable, dry, and relatively inert. But biology needs water to function, and the moment the baker pours buckets of water into the trough, the chemistry of the dough begins. As the water makes contact with the flour, the color changes instantly. Clean rye flour turns a concrete gray when wet, but this flour, speckled with the invisible dust of the pulverized sclerotia, takes on a darker, more ominous hue. It becomes the color of wet slate or a bruised plum. The water functions as a solvent. It dissolves the sugars in the rye, but it also starts to leach the alkaloids out of the fungal particles. The poison is no longer confined in tiny solids. It is now seeping into the liquid phase of the dough, ensuring it will permeate every single crumb of the finished loaf. The baker rolls up his sleeves and thrusts his hands into the mass. This is not the elastic, soft dough of white wheat bread. Wheat has gluten, a protein that forms stretchy, rubbery networks that trap gas and allow the bread to rise. Rye is different. Rye is low in gluten and high in substances called pentasans, complex sugars that absorb vast quantities of water and form a sticky, viscous gel. Working with rye dough is less like baking and more like masonry. It feels like wet clay or heavy mud. It sticks to the skin, coats the fingers, and resists manipulation. As the baker wrestles with this heavy, grey sludge, he adds the most vital ingredient of the medieval kitchen, the levain, or sourdough starter. This is a preserved piece of dough from the previous day's batch, teeming with wild yeasts and lactobacillus bacteria. In a normal loaf, this starter is a miracle worker. The bacteria produce lactic and acetic acid, which gives the bread its sour taste. This acidity is usually a safety measure. It lowers the pH of the dough, killing off harmful bacteria and molds that might have accompanied the grain. It is a natural preservative. But against the alkaloids of Claviceps purpurea, this biological defense system is completely ineffective. The toxins in ergot, ergotamine, ergocristine, and their relatives, are remarkably stable in acidic conditions. In fact, the acidic environment of the sourdough fermentation might actually help to stabilize them, making them more soluble and easier for the body to absorb later. The yeast consumes the sugars, producing bubbles of carbon dioxide that struggle to lift the heavy, gum-laden rye paste. The dough rises slowly, obstinately, expanding just enough to resemble a loaf, but remaining dense enough to be used as a weapon. After hours of fermentation, during which the dough sits in the warm darkness of the bakery, bubbling sluggishly, it is shaped into rounds and placed in the oven. You might assume that fire would be the great purifier. The oven floor is over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Surely, no biological poison could withstand that inferno. But bread is an excellent insulator. While the crust of the loaf is blasted by the heat, turning hard and brown, the interior of the loaf, the crumb, experiences a very different reality. Because the dough is so wet and dense, the temperature inside the loaf rises slowly. It essentially steams itself. The internal temperature of a baked loaf of bread rarely surpasses 210 degrees Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water. This is the thermal lag. For the ergot alkaloids, this temperature is uncomfortable, but not lethal. These molecules are heat-stable survivors. They do not decompose at the boiling point of water. They do not denature like an egg white. They remain chemically intact. In fact, some historians speculate that the heat of the oven might alter the chemical structure of the alkaloids in a way that enhances their hallucinogenic effects, converting some of the lysergic acid derivatives into more active forms. The loaf that emerges from the oven an hour later is a deception. On the outside, it looks like food. It has a thick, hard crust, dusted with ash from the oven floor. It smells of wood smoke and roasted grain. But inside, encased in the moist, dense crumb, the poison has been preserved, activated, and evenly distributed. The loaf is heavy. A single portion might weigh 2 or 3 pounds. It is dense, moist, and sour. It is designed to sustain life, to provide the energy for another day of back-breaking labor. But as it cools on the wooden rack, settling into its final form, it is no longer just bread. It is a delivery system. The sun has finally set below the horizon, marking the end of a 14-hour shift in the fields. The work is finished, the tools are put away, and the only thing that matters now is the wooden table in the middle of your home. It is time for the evening meal. This is the moment the entire day has been leading up to, the caloric refueling that makes tomorrow possible. You sit down on a rough bench, your muscles aching with a dull, rhythmic pain, and you reach for the loaf that was baked in that soot-stained oven this morning. You pull a small knife from your belt. It is iron, probably dull, and you have to saw at the loaf to break through it. The crust of a medieval rye loaf is not the delicate, flaky shell of a modern baguette. It is thick, armoured plating, hardened by the intense heat of the oven floor. It offers considerable resistance. When you finally break through, you are not met with a puff of steam or a soft, yielding interior. The crumb inside is dense and damp. It clings to the knife. Because of the high pentasan content and the weight of the dough, the bread has a texture closer to heavy cake or wet clay than what we would consider bread today. It is substantial. It feels heavy in the hand, a dense brick of energy. You tear off a piece. The texture is the first thing you notice. It is chewy, requiring significant jaw work to break down. As you chew, the flavor profile starts to emerge. The dominant note is sourness. The long fermentation with the wild sourdough culture has filled the dough with acetic acid, giving it a sharp, tangy bite that makes the sides of your tongue tingle. This sourness is the defining characteristic of peasant bread. It is the taste of safety, the signal that the dough was fermented long enough to prevent it from spoiling. But tonight, there is another note hidden beneath the sour tang. It is a subtle, creeping bitterness. If you were an expert on poisons, you might recognize it. The alkaloids produced by Claviceps purpurea, specifically ergotamine, have a distinct, sharp, biting flavor. It tastes slightly chemical, a burning sensation that sits at the back of your throat. However, you are not an expert. You are a hungry laborer accustomed to eating food that is often on the verge of going bad. You are used to grain that tastes a little earthy, a little dusty, or a little old. Furthermore, you rarely eat the bread by itself. To make the dense, sour loaf palatable, you use it as a utensil. You dip the piece of bread into a bowl of pottage, a stew made of boiled cabbage, onions, beans, and perhaps a bit of salted pork fat. The pottage is heavily seasoned with whatever is available to mask the monotony of the diet. It is salty, garlicky, and rich with the flavor of boiled vegetables. You sop up the liquid with the bread, allowing the hot, savory broth to soak into the dense crumb. This culinary habit is the final camouflage. The salt and the garlic in the stew completely overpower the subtle, bitter warning signal of the ergot. The texture of the pottage masks the grit of the ground-up sclerotia. You are effectively hiding the poison inside the cure. You chew, you swallow, and the first dose of the toxin enters your system. It is crucial to understand that this is not a fast-acting poison. If you dropped dead the moment you took a bite, the village would stop eating the bread immediately. Ergot is far more insidious. It is a cumulative toxin. The amount you consume tonight is not enough to kill you. But the bread is your staple. You will eat it again for breakfast, for lunch, and again tomorrow night. With every meal, the concentration of the toxin in your blood rises slightly, slowly reaching a saturation point. The tragedy of this consumption is its universality. If this were a luxury item, only the wealthy would suffer. If it were a specific foraged mushroom, only the adventurous would die. But bread is the common denominator. At your table, everyone is eating from the same loaf. The strong father, the nursing mother, the elderly grandparent, and the small child. They are all ingesting the same poison, portioned out according to their hunger. The entire family unit is being contaminated simultaneously. The bakery has effectively synchronized the disaster. You wipe the last of the pottage from your bowl with the last crust of bread, swallow it down, and lean back, feeling the comforting weight of a full stomach. You have survived the hunger of the day. But deep inside your digestion, the holy fire has just been kindled. The meal is over. The wooden bowls are scraped clean. The fire is banked low for the night, and the heavy silence of the medieval evening descends upon the house. You climb into your bed, a pallet of straw covered with rough wool blankets, and wait for sleep to come. Digestion is a quiet, automatic process, usually unnoticed. But tonight, as your stomach breaks down the dense rye paste, it is extracting more than just calories. It is liberating the alkaloids from the fat-soluble matrix of the bread and releasing them into your bloodstream. The poison is now systemic. It is circulating through your heart, pumping out to every organ, every muscle, and every nerve ending in your body. The first indication that something is wrong is not pain, it is temperature. As you lie in the darkness, you notice that your feet are cold. This, in itself, is not unusual. It is the 14th century, the house is drafty, and the winter ground is frozen. You pull the wool blanket tighter around your legs, curling up to conserve body heat. You expect the warmth to return, for the blood to flow back into your toes as you settle in. But the warmth does not come. In fact, the cold seems to intensify. It is not a surface chill from the air on your skin. It is a profound, internal iciness that feels as if the bone itself has dropped in temperature. This is the mechanical action of ergotamine at work. The alkaloid is a potent vasoconstrictor. It binds to the receptors on the smooth muscle cells lining your arteries and commands them to contract. Your blood vessels are essentially reacting as if you are in severe shock or extreme hypothermia. They are clamping down, narrowing the diameter of the pipes that carry life-sustaining oxygen to your periphery. Your body, under the influence of the toxin, believes it is dying of cold, and so it prioritizes the core organs, the heart, the lungs, the brain, at the expense of the extremities. Your toes, your fingers, your nose, and your ears are being slowly, chemically strangled. It is as if an invisible tourniquet has been applied to every limb, tightened just enough to restrict flow, but not enough to stop it entirely. Yet. You drift into a restless sleep, but you wake up an hour later with a strange sensation in your hands. You shake them out, assuming you must have slept on your arm incorrectly, cutting off the circulation. We have all felt that dead, heavy sensation when a limb falls asleep. But this is different. As the blood struggles to push through the narrowed vessels, the nerves begin to misfire. They are being starved of oxygen, and they send confused, chaotic signals back to the brain. It starts as a tingling, a subtle vibration under the skin. It feels like pins and needles, but sharper, more persistent. The medical term for this is paresthesia. To the medieval peasant, unversed in neurology, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like insects. There is a specific sensation associated with ergot poisoning called formication, from the Latin word for ant. You feel as though hundreds of tiny ants are crawling just beneath the surface of your skin, marching from your fingertips up towards your wrists. You rub your hands together, trying to brush them away, trying to restore sensation. But the feeling is internal. The ants are in your nerves, not on your skin. By morning, the symptoms have not vanished. They have settled. You stand up to start the day, and your legs feel heavy, like lead. When you walk to the door, you feel a cramping pain in your calves. This is claudication, muscle pain caused by a lack of blood flow during exercise. Your muscles are screaming for oxygen, but the narrowed arteries cannot deliver it. You dismiss it as fatigue. You tell yourself you worked too hard in the fields yesterday. You tell yourself it is just the damp weather getting into your joints. The human capacity for denial is powerful, especially when the alternative is to admit that the food keeping you alive is also making you sick. You sit down for breakfast. You break off another piece of the dark, sour rye bread. You are hungry, and the cold in your limbs makes you crave the energy. You eat. With this second dose, you are reinforcing the command to your blood vessels. The clamp tightens. The blood pressure in your core spikes, while the pressure in your limbs plummets. Your complexion might look pale, waxy, or grey as the blood drains away from the surface of the skin. You are becoming a ghost in your own body. At this stage, the poisoning is still reversible. If you were to stop eating the bread now, if you were to switch to a diet of pure meat or vegetables, your liver would eventually process the toxins, the vessels would relax, and the blood would return to your starving tissues. But you don't know that. You don't know that the bread is the enemy. So you finish your meal and you head out into the cold morning to work, forcing your numb, tingling limbs to move. As the days pass, the symptoms will cease to be subtle. The tingling will turn to burning. The numbness will turn to necrosis. The poison has saturated your system, and now it will choose a path. The disease is about to diverge into two distinct, horrifying presentations, depending on the specific ratio of alkaloids in the fungus and your own individual biology. You are standing at a physiological fork in the road. Down one path lies the fire that consumes the body. Down the other lies the madness that consumes the mind. You are about to walk down one of them. Let us follow the first course of the disease, the one that assaults the body's framework. In the medical records of the era, and for centuries after, This manifestation was given a name that evokes both divinity and dread: Ignis Sacer, or the Holy Fire. It was a name earned through feeling. As the days go by and you continue to eat the tainted rye, the initial numbness in your extremities undergoes a violent change. The tingling ants cease their crawling and begin to bite. The sensation shifts from a dull absence of feeling to an excruciating, searing heat. It feels, quite literally, as if your hands and feet are being held directly in the flames of the hearth. The pain is absolute and relentless. It is a deep, nerve-shredding burning that makes sleep impossible. You might find yourself plunging your feet into buckets of ice-cold well water, desperate for relief. But the water does nothing. The fire is not on your skin, it is inside your veins. The cruel irony of this phase is a physical contradiction. While you are screaming that your feet are burning alive, to the touch, they are as cold as marble. The blood has stopped flowing entirely. Your nerves are dying, screaming out their final signals of distress before they are silenced forever. Then comes the visual transformation. It begins at the tips of the toes or fingers. The pale, waxy skin that signaled the early onset now begins to darken. It turns a bruised red, then a deep, deoxygenated purple, and finally, it settles into a stark, absolute black. This is not the black of a bruise, it is the black of charcoal. It is the color of dead carbon. The tissue has undergone necrosis. It has died while still attached to your living body. This is the onset of dry gangrene. Unlike wet gangrene, which is caused by bacterial infection and results in a swollen, pus-filled rot, dry gangrene is a process of desiccation. It is mummification. Because the blood supply has been so thoroughly strangled by the ergot alkaloids, there is no fluid left in the tissue to support rot. The flesh simply dries out. It shrivels, shrinking down against the bone. The skin becomes hard and leathery, tapping against the floor like wood rather than flesh. The blackness does not stay put. It creeps. Day by day, meal by meal, the necrosis moves up the limb. It consumes the foot, rising past the ankle and up the shin. It consumes the hand, moving past the wrist and up the forearm. It is a slow, relentless tide of death. But then, it stops. The body, in a last-ditch effort to save the core organs, establishes a border. This is known as the line of demarcation. On your leg, perhaps just below the knee, you will see a vivid red line. Above this line, the skin is pink, warm, and alive. Below this line, the leg is black, shriveled, and dead. This is the battlefield where your immune system has drawn a truce with the poison. The tissue at the line is inflamed and raw as the body attempts to reject the dead weight attached to it. Now comes the most horrific phase of the logistics, the separation. The dead tissue is no longer part of you. It is a foreign object. Over the course of weeks, the dry, blackened limb begins to detach. The skin breaks along the red line. The tendons, dried and brittle, snap. Eventually, only the bone connects the living to the dead, and often the bone itself, brittle and deprived of nutrients, will fracture. The limb simply falls off. The most shocking aspect of this auto-amputation is the lack of blood. You might expect a traumatic event like losing a foot to be a bloody mess, but the ergot has done its work too well. The arteries constrict so violently they effectively fuse shut, ensuring the limb separates with almost no bleeding. It is a dry amputation. A peasant might wake up in the morning to find their foot lying in the straw at the bottom of the bed, detached during the restless movements of the night. The smell in the house during this period is specific. It is not the sharp stench of wet rot, but the sickly sweet, cloying odour of decaying meat and dried musk. It permeates the bedding and the clothes, and yet, life continues. The victim, often a child or a strong laborer, does not necessarily die. The gangrene is localized. Once the dead limb is gone, the fire often subsides. The stump heals over, leaving a rounded, scarred end. You survive the bread, but you are changed. The village becomes a community of the disfigured. You see men walking on wooden pegs where their feet used to be. You see women with hooks or leather cups replacing their hands. They are the survivors of the holy fire, living testaments to a harvest that tried to consume them. They continue to eat the rye because there is nothing else, praying that the next batch of flour does not carry the burning seed. But for others, the poison does not stop at the limbs. It bypasses the arteries and goes straight for the brain. For them, the fire is not in the feet, but in the mind. While the gangrenous form of the illness works its way inward from the extremities, slowly disabling the body's plumbing, the second manifestation of ergotism attacks the control center itself. This is the path of the convulsive form. It is a different kind of horror. If gangrene is a silent, cold subtraction of the self, convulsive ergotism is a loud, violent addition of chaos. It does not attack the blood vessels, it attacks the central nervous system. The alkaloids, specifically the lysergic acid derivatives hidden in that dark rye bread, cross the blood-brain barrier and begin to interface directly with your neurotransmitters. They are chemical imposters, mimicking serotonin, hijacking the electrical signals that tell your muscles when to move and your brain what is real. The onset is not characterized by numbness, but by twitching. It begins with a subtle, involuntary tremor in the fingers or the eyelids. You might try to steady your hand against the table, but the muscle refuses to obey. The signal is coming from deep inside the brainstem, a misfiring of the motor neurons that cannot be suppressed by will. Quickly, these tremors escalate into full-blown spasms. The medical texts of the time describe a specific, terrifying deformation of the hands, known as the main d'accoucheur, or the obstetrician's hand. The fingers are forced together, the thumb tucked under, and the wrist flexed sharply. It looks like a claw. The muscles contract with such violence that the fingernails can cut into the palm, drawing blood that the victim cannot feel because their sensory processing has been completely scrambled. But the spasms do not stop at the hands. They travel up the arms, into the shoulders, and down the spine. The body is seized by a force that feels external. The muscles of the back contract simultaneously, pulling the victim backward into a rigid arc. This is a condition called opisthotonos. The victim is bent like a bow, resting only on their heels and the back of their head, their spine curved to the breaking point. It is a posture of impossible tension. To the terrified family watching from the corner of the room, it does not look like a disease. It looks like the body is being twisted by an invisible set of hands. It looks, in every meaningful sense of the medieval worldview, like demonic possession. This is where the dance begins. The seizures are rarely static. The misfiring nerves cause the limbs to thrash and jerk in a grotesque parody of movement. A victim might leap into the air, spin around, or throw themselves against the walls of the house. This is not a conscious choice. It is the result of a nervous system caught in a chemical electrical storm. In historical outbreaks, entire families would be affected simultaneously. Imagine a small, dimly lit cottage where 4 or 5 people are writhing on the floor, their bodies jerking in unison to a rhythm set by the fungal toxin. It was often called Saint Vitus's dance, or chorea, although that name was later applied to other conditions. For the ergot victim, it was a dance of pure agony, a marathon of motion that could last for hours, leaving the muscles torn and the body utterly exhausted. And while the body is dancing, the mind is traveling. The alkaloids in ergot are chemically related to LSD-25, They are potent hallucinogens, but unlike a controlled recreational dose, this is a dirty trip mixed with toxicity and physical pain. The hallucinations are rarely euphoric. They are nightmarish. The brain, flooded with serotonin mimics, begins to project terrors onto the visual field. The most common hallucination is fire. The victim sees the walls of the house engulfed in flames, reinforcing the physical sensation of burning in their limbs. Others see animals. The dark corners of the room spawn wolves, dogs, or serpents. The tactile sensation of crawling insects becomes visual. The victim sees their own skin teeming with vermin, scratching frantically to remove parasites that exist only in their firing synapses. They might see demons, dark figures standing at the foot of the bed, or angels descending with swords. The filter between the internal subconscious and the external world has been dissolved. The final element of this horror is the noise. Convulsive ergotism affects the muscles of the throat and the tongue. The victim loses the ability to articulate speech. They try to call for help, but what comes out is a series of guttural sounds, barks, shrieks, or unintelligible babbling. They might speak in tongues, their words scrambled into a syntax that sounds like a foreign or satanic language. When you combine the physical contortions, the terrified staring at invisible fires, and the inhuman vocalizations, it is easy to see why the medieval mind leaped to a supernatural conclusion. This was not seen as a dietary failure, it was seen as a battle for the soul, fought on the battleground of the body. And the tragedy was that the cure, praying, fasting, and gathering together in the church, often meant sharing more of the same contaminated bread, fueling the dance until the heart, exhausted by the strain, finally stopped beating. To grasp the true potential of this fungus, we must leave the isolation of the individual peasant dwelling and consult a map. We must zoom out from the single tragedy of a family to the collective nightmare of a nation. The history of ergotism is marked by massive, rolling epidemics that ravaged entire regions, but few are as well documented or as horrifying as the catastrophe that struck Aquitaine in southern France in the year 994 AD. The timing was especially cruel. It was the end of the first millennium, and the population of Europe was already gripped by theological unease, searching for signs of the apocalypse. In the harvest of 993, the weather created the perfect conditions. A long, cold winter was followed by a damp, grey spring that kept the fields of Aquitaine perpetually moist. For the rye crop, it was a disaster. For Claviceps purpurea, it was a paradise. The fungus flourished with unprecedented virulence, and the wet harvest was stored in granaries that became incubators for the toxin. When the new flour reached the bakeries of Aquitaine that autumn, the effect was immediate and devastating. It did not strike a few isolated villages, it struck the entire region at once. The chroniclers of the time, monks scribbling in their scriptoriums by candlelight, struggled to find the words to describe what they were witnessing. They wrote of a hidden fire that consumed the population. They described invisible flames that detached limbs and drove men mad. The death toll was staggering. In this single outbreak, it is estimated that 40,000 people died. In the context of the 10th century, where populations were sparse and scattered, this was not just a tragedy, it was a demographic collapse. It was a mortality rate comparable to the Black Death that would arrive centuries later, but concentrated in a specific region and caused entirely by the daily bread. The social fabric of Aquitaine began to unravel. The sheer number of victims overwhelmed the ability of the living to care for them. In the villages, the screams of the dancing victims echoed through the night, mingling with the silence of the gangrenous dying. The burial logistics failed completely. There were not enough healthy men to dig the graves. The frozen ground of the coming winter made interment impossible, and the bodies were often left in the fields or stacked in the churchyards, adding the risk of secondary plagues to the chemical poisoning. In a desperate attempt to stop the holy fire, the people turned to the only institution that offered hope, the church. A mass migration began. Thousands of sufferers, hobbling on stumps or carried on stretchers, flooded toward the city of Limoges. They were coming to pray at the tomb of Saint Martial, the apostle of Aquitaine. They believed that proximity to the holy relics would douse the invisible flames in their veins. The city of Limoges was besieged by its own refugees. Streets were clogged with the sick, and the air grew heavy with the sweet scent of gangrenous flesh. The cathedral was packed to capacity with a sea of writhing, praying humanity. The Duke of Aquitaine and the bishops declared a peace of God, a truce to focus on the catastrophe. But the tragedy of this gathering was nutritional. In an act of charity, the church fed the pilgrims. If the church granaries held the same rye as the villages, the cure simply extended the poisoning. The chronicler, Adhemar of Chabannes, wrote that the bodies of the dead piled up like waves. It was a biological apocalypse, interpreted as a spiritual judgment. The people of Aquitaine believed they were being punished for their sins. They did not know, and could not know, that the agent of their destruction was not a vengeful god, but a microscopic spore hiding in the dark, speckled crust of their charity loaves. The catastrophe of 994 left a scar on the European psyche that would last for centuries, birthing a new order of monks dedicated specifically to the care of those consumed by the fire. From the ashes of the Aquitaine catastrophe and the subsequent rolling epidemics, a distinct institutional response arose. It was part church, part hospice, and part surgical ward. It was the Order of Saint Anthony. Initially founded as a lay brotherhood in France around 1095, it quickly evolved into a powerful order of monks devoted to a single grim mission: the treatment of those consumed by the holy fire. If you were a peasant suffering from the burning in your limbs, the Hospital of Saint Anthony was your last hope. As you neared one of their commanderies, and there were eventually almost 400 of them scattered across Europe, you would be struck by the colour. The visual theme of the Antonine hospitals was deliberately overwhelmingly red. The monks believed in the principle of sympathetic magic, like cures like. To treat the fire in the blood, they surrounded the patient with the colour of fire. The walls of the hospital wards were often painted a deep, visceral red. The monks themselves wore black robes emblazoned with a large blue T-shaped cross, the Tau, which dripped with a stylized red border representing blood or fire. Entering the hospital was a sensory assault. The air was thick with incense, used to mask the smell of necrosis, but beneath the frankincense was the heavy, savory scent of rendered animal fat. The primary topical treatment developed by the order was a balm made from pork lard. The Antonines were famous for their pigs. In many medieval cities, livestock was banned from roaming the streets to maintain sanitation, but the pigs of St. Anthony were granted a special exemption. They were allowed to forage freely, identified by small bells tied around their necks. These pigs were not just livestock, they were medical supplies on hooves. When a patient arrived, their blackened, burning limbs were coated in this cool, rendered lard, often mixed with herbs like verbena and plantain. The fat provided a barrier, keeping the necrotic skin from cracking and soothing the raw nerve endings. It was a palliative measure, designed to make the pain bearable while the disease ran its course. For many, the course was amputation. The Antonine monks became the premier surgeons of the Middle Ages, not by choice, but by necessity. They developed a grim expertise in removing dead limbs. In the entrance halls of some Antonine hospitals, visitors would be greeted by a macabre display: withered, blackened limbs hanging from the ceiling or pinned to the walls. These were not trophies, They were votive offerings, surrendered by survivors who had left their feet behind in exchange for their lives. But the true genius of the Order of St. Anthony, the secret that allowed them to boast such miraculous recovery rates, was not in the surgery, the red paint, or the holy water. It was in the kitchen. The order was wealthy. As the primary defense against the terrifying plague, they received massive donations from fearful nobles and grateful survivors. This wealth translated into purchasing power. While the peasantry outside the hospital walls was subsisting on the dark, contaminated rye of the local harvest, the monks could afford to import grain. They could buy wheat. Wheat, as we have noted, is largely immune to the ergot fungus. The white bread of the aristocracy was safe. When a patient was admitted to the hospital, their diet changed instantly. The dark, sour rye loaf was taken away. In its place, they were fed a ration of wassail, or clean wheat bread, accompanied by wine, often called St. Anthony's water, which was sometimes infused with herbs that had mild vasodilating properties. The mechanism of the miracle was purely metabolic. By switching the patient to a wheat-based diet, the monks were cutting off the supply of toxins. The patient was effectively put on a detox program. Without the daily dose of ergotamine, the constriction in the blood vessels began to relax. The blood flow returned to the borders of the living tissue. The burning subsided. The hallucinations faded as the serotonin mimics were flushed from the brain. To the medieval mind, this recovery was a divine intervention attributed to the intercession of the saint. To the modern nutritionist, it is a simple cause and effect of dietary management. The hospital was a controlled environment where the poison was absent. However, this accidental cure carried a cruel sting in the tail. The patient, now healed and praising the monks, would eventually be discharged. They would walk out of the red-walled sanctuary and return to their village, to their family, and inevitably to their own table. They would sit down to celebrate their return and break bread, the same dark, rye bread that had poisoned them in the first place. Within weeks, the fire would return. This cycle of recovery and relapse only strengthened the belief that the disease was a spiritual affliction, a sin that clung to the soul, rather than a fungus that clung to the grain. The question that inevitably troubles the modern mind when examining these centuries of poisoning is straightforward. Why didn't they stop? If the bread was causing limbs to blacken and minds to fracture, why did the village continue to bake it, break it, and eat it, day after day? The answer lies not in foolishness or ignorance, but in the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of medieval economics. It was a choice between a likely sickness later and a certain death by starvation now. To grasp this, we must consider the hierarchy of grain. In the medieval market, wheat was the gold standard, clean, sweet, and safe. But as we've established, wheat is delicate. For the peasant farmer on marginal land, planting wheat was a gamble they couldn't afford. Rye was the insurance policy. But this dependability came with a hidden price. To eat safely, one had to eat wheat. But wheat was prohibitively expensive. In a year of poor harvest, the cost of clean wheat could be 5 or 10 times that of rye. For a family already on the brink of subsistence, switching to wheat was as financially unfeasible as buying a castle. The market's economics effectively trapped them in the danger zone. They were priced out of safety. Then there is the structural trap of the feudal system itself. The peasant did not own the grain they cultivated. A significant portion of the harvest was owed to the landlord, the church, and the miller as rent, tithes, and taxes. This payment was rarely made in cash, it was made in kind. The lord took his share in grain. But the lord was not foolish. He demanded the best grain. When the harvest was brought in, it was often sorted. The cleanest, plumpest, heaviest grain, the prime harvest, was skimmed off the top to pay the rent, or to be sold at market to the cities. This grain was less likely to be heavily contaminated, or, if it was diluted by the sheer volume of the Lord's granaries. What was left for the peasant family was the tailings. This was the grain at the bottom of the pile, the grain that was too light, too small, or too dirty to sell. It was the dregs of the harvest, and because of how ergot sclerotia behave, being similar in weight to the grain but often mixed into the rougher, uncleaned batches, the poison was disproportionately concentrated in the peasant's share. The economic filter of feudalism acted like a centrifuge, spinning the clean food upward to the wealthy and forcing the toxic impurities downward to the poor. Finally, consider the psychology of the season. When the previous year's stores are depleted and the bin is scraped clean, the family operates on empty. At this moment of weakness, the temptation to eat bad grain overrides caution. Imagine you are a parent in this situation. You have a sack of rye flour in the back of the pantry. It is dark. It smells faintly of fish, and you know, in the back of your mind, that the neighbours who ate similar flour last month are now walking on crutches. But your children are crying from hunger, their ribs are showing, the lethargy of starvation is setting in. You look at the flour. It is food. It is calories. The danger of the ergot is abstract, invisible, and potential. The danger of starvation is immediate, visceral, and certain. You make the only tactical decision available to you. You bake the bread. You tell yourself that maybe this batch is safe. Maybe if you sift it one more time, it will be fine. You engage in a necessary denial, a suspension of disbelief required to survive the night. You feed your family, buying them another day of life with the very substance that might slowly be killing them. It is a gamble made at every meal, a game of gastronomic roulette, played not for thrill, but for existence. And so the cycle continued, driven by the harsh reality that in a famine, even poison looks like salvation. This economic deadlock ensured that ergotism remained a constant companion to the poor for centuries, lurking in the shadow of the daily loaf. As the centuries grind on, moving from the dark, chaotic medieval era into the early modern period, the biology of the fungus remains perfectly unchanged. Claviceps purpurea does not evolve. It does not alter its strategy. It waits in the soil, it infects the rye, and it produces the same cocktail of alkaloids it has produced for millennia. The poison is consistent, but the human mind, the vessel that receives this poison, is changing. We leave behind the era of the holy fire, where symptoms were seen as a collective divine punishment or a mysterious plague to be treated with pilgrimage and pork fat. We enter the 17th century, a time of profound religious rigidity, political paranoia, and a desperate fear of the unseen world. The lens through which the sufferer views their own body has shifted. In the medieval mind, a burning limb was a sign of God's wrath. In the 17th century mind, particularly within the strict Protestant and Puritan communities of Northern Europe and the American colonies, a convulsing body is no longer just sick, it is bewitched. The symptoms of ergotism, especially the convulsive type, begin to align with terrifying precision with the cultural checklist for witchcraft. Consider the victim's physical experience through the eyes of a witch hunter. The victim is not merely trembling, they are writhing in impossible postures, their spine bent backward in the opisthotonous arc. To the medical observer, this is a neuromuscular failure. To the Puritan observer, this is the physical manifestation of a struggle with the devil. The victim is being ridden by an invisible entity. The loss of speech, the barking sounds, the inability to recite the Lord's Prayer without stuttering. These are not seen as the result of a chemically scrambled brainstem, but as proof that the tongue is under the control of a dark spirit. Even the quieter symptoms are reinterpreted. The crawling sensation beneath the skin is no longer dismissed as a circulation issue. In the lexicon of the 17th century, this is described as being pricked with pins. The victim cries out that they are being pinched, bitten, or stabbed by invisible agents. They rub their arms, claiming they can feel the touch of a familiar, a witch's animal spirit sent to torment them. But the most dangerous shift occurs in the realm of the visual. The hallucinations caused by the lysergic acid derivatives in the bread were once personal nightmares, visions of fire or demons that belonged to the sufferer alone. In the legal systems of the 17th century, these hallucinations are elevated to the status of forensic evidence. This is the birth of spectral evidence. The logic is deadly simple. If you are hallucinating, and in your delirium you see the shape of your neighbor standing at the foot of your bed, or you see a spectre that looks like the local miller pinching you, the court accepts this vision as fact. The belief is that the devil cannot assume the shape of an innocent person without their permission. Therefore, if you see your neighbor's spirit while you are thrashing in a fit, your neighbor must have signed a compact with hell. The hallucination is no longer a symptom, it is an accusation. The bread has become a generator of treason. A teenage girl eats a contaminated loaf for breakfast. By noon, the alkaloids trigger a seizure and a visual distortion. She points a trembling finger at a woman across the room and screams that she sees a yellow bird suckling at her finger, or a dark shadow whispering in her ear. In a court of law, this chemical mirage is treated with the same weight as a signed confession. The tragedy of this era is that the crime is contagious, not because of a conspiracy, but because of the shared food supply. The accuser and the accused are often neighbors. They buy from the same miller. They bake from the same sack. The witch might be suffering from mild gangrenous symptoms, a coldness in the hands, a strange mark on the skin where the blood flow has died, which is then identified as a witch's teat or a devil's mark. The victim is suffering from convulsive symptoms. Both are poisoned by the same harvest, but the culture turns them against each other, interpreting their shared biological toxicity as a spiritual war. The fungus has moved from the hospital ward to the gallows. To witness the perfect confluence of biology, meteorology, and theology, we must journey to the rocky, unforgiving coast of Massachusetts Bay. The year is 1692. The place is Salem, but not the bustling port town with its wharves and merchants. We are going inland to the agricultural satellite known as Salem Village, now modern-day Danvers. This is the impoverished cousin of the settlement, a scattered collection of farmsteads waging a constant war against the stony New England soil and the encroaching forest. The winter of 1692 was not merely cold, it was a siege. The snows were deep, sealing households into a state of claustrophobic isolation. The roads were impassable for weeks at a time. The village became a series of islands, each house a closed ecosystem where the family huddled around the hearth, breathing the same stale air and eating from the same dwindling stockpile of food. It is here, in the dark, freezing silence of the Puritan winter, that the pantry becomes the most dangerous room in the house. To understand why the tragedy began here, we have to look back, not at the stars or the scriptures, but at the weather report for the previous year. The growing season of 1691 was a botanical catastrophe. The spring had been unusually wet, turning the low-lying fields of Salem Village into bogs. The rye, planted in the damp, acidic soil that characterizes this region, sat in standing water during its most vulnerable developmental phase. This was followed by a summer that was hot and stormy, a humid, stifling season that encouraged the fungal spores to bloom. The farmers of Salem Village were not botanists, they were survivalists. When they went out to harvest the rye in the late summer of 1691, they likely saw the signs of the infection. They would have seen the black spurs on the grain, the darkened heads of the rye. But as we have seen in Europe, the logic of survival overrides the logic of safety. The harvest was brought in, the grain was threshed, winnowed, likely poorly given the exhaustion of the labor, and stored in the barns. It sat there through the autumn, a dormant biological weapon, waiting for the miller. The epicenter of the coming storm was the parsonage, the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris. The economics of the Parris household are critical to the theory of the poisoning. Parris was not a wealthy merchant buying clean wheat from the coast. He was a minister paid by a congregation of farmers, and a significant portion of his salary was paid in kind. This meant he was given firewood and grain directly from the fields of his parishioners. Specifically, he was supplied by the farmers on the western side of the village, the side with the swampiest land, and therefore the highest probability of ergot contamination. Inside the parsonage, the diet was monotonous. The primary source of calories was the dark, dense rye bread baked by the household slave Tituba. It was eaten at every meal. The household was a closed loop of consumption. The Reverend, his wife, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams were all eating from the same tainted supply. However, biology is not democratic. The toxin affects different bodies in different ways, based on body weight, metabolism, and liver function.